Now we come to one of the most important comparison slides in the entire presentation. This slide explains how the meaning of one important literary concept changed over time. That concept is called mimesis. The word mimesis comes from the Greek language and simply means imitation. At first, this seems like a very easy word. But immediately a question arises. Imitation of what? Should literature imitate nature? Should it imitate reality? Should it imitate great writers? Should it simply copy what already exists? Three great critics answered these questions in three completely different ways. That is exactly what this slide explains. Notice the arrows connecting the three boxes. They show that literary criticism did not remain the same. It evolved. One thinker responded to another. Each critic developed the idea further. So, let us understand this journey step by step. First stage, Plato's view. Let us begin with Plato. Look at the first box. It says, a copy of a copy. This is probably Plato's most famous criticism of poetry. To understand this, we must first understand Plato's philosophy. Plato believed that there are three levels of reality. The first level is the world of forms or world of ideas. According to Plato, this is the perfect world. Everything there is eternal, perfect, and unchanging. For example, there is a perfect idea of a chair. There is a perfect idea of beauty. There is a perfect idea of justice. These perfect forms are the highest reality. The second level is our physical world. The chair we sit on, the trees we see, the houses we live in, all these are imperfect copies of the perfect forms. Now comes the third level. Suppose an artist paints the chair, or a poet describes the chair. The painting is not the real chair. It is only an image of the chair. Since the chair itself is already an imperfect copy of the perfect form, the painting becomes a copy of a copy. That is why Plato says art is far removed from truth. Why does Plato reject mimesis? Look at the second point. It says, negative, deceptive mimicry of physical reality. Plato believed that art creates appearances, not truth. A painting may look like a horse, but it cannot run. A poem may describe courage, but it is not courage itself. Therefore, art can easily deceive people. It may make imagination appear more important than truth. Plato feared that poetry could excite emotions, weaken reason, and mislead society. That is why he viewed imitation negatively. A simple example. Imagine looking into a mirror. You see your reflection. The reflection looks exactly like you. But can it speak? Can it think? Can it help you? No. It is only an image. Plato believed art is similar. It reflects reality, but it is not reality itself. Therefore, he considered imitation unreliable. Second stage, Aristotle's view. Now let us move to Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. However, he completely changed his teacher's understanding of imitation. Look at the second box. It says, a natural intellectual instinct to learn. This is a revolutionary idea. Aristotle asks a very simple question. How do children learn? They learn by imitation. A child learns to speak by copying parents. A student learns by observing teachers. An apprentice learns by watching a master. Therefore, imitation is not something harmful. It is a natural part of human learning. Instead of criticizing imitation, Aristotle praises it. Literature does more than copy. Aristotle says literature does not merely copy individual events. Instead, it represents universal truths. What does that mean? History tells us what happened to one particular person. Literature tells us what can happen to any human being. That is why Aristotle believed poetry is often more philosophical than history. For example, many people have never been princes like Hamlet. But almost everyone has experienced confusion, indecision, grief, or self-doubt. Therefore, Hamlet represents universal human experience. This is what Aristotle means by imitation. It is not copying, it is revealing deeper truths about human life. Plato and Aristotle compared. Notice the difference between these two philosophers. Plato says, poetry copies appearances and moves us away from truth. Aristotle replies, poetry reveals universal truths and helps us understand life. Both use the same word, mimesis, but they give it completely different meanings. This is why Aristotle is considered a turning point in literary criticism. Third stage, Horace's shift. Now let us move to the third box. Here, Horace changes the discussion again. Look at the definition. It says, imitating other great writers, not just nature. This is a practical approach. Horace is less interested in debating whether imitation is good or bad. Instead, he asks, how does a poet become great? His answer is simple. Study the greatest writers. Read Homer. Read Sophocles. Read Euripides. Observe how they construct plots. Observe how they develop characters. Observe how they choose words. Then learn from them. Does Horace encourage copying? This is a very important question. No, Horace does not encourage blind copying. There is a huge difference between copying and creative imitation. Copying means repeating another person's work exactly. Creative imitation means learning principles, techniques, and artistic skills, then creating something original. That is exactly what Horace recommends. He wants young poets to learn from masters, not become their duplicates. A simple modern example. Think about learning music. A beginner first sings famous songs. The student carefully studies rhythm, melody, and pronunciation. Later, after gaining experience, the musician begins composing original songs. Nobody criticizes this process. It is how learning happens. Horace believed writing develops in exactly the same way. Great writers become our teachers. Another example. Imagine an architecture student. Before designing a new building, the student studies famous structures around the world. The student learns why they are beautiful, why they are strong, and why they have lasted for centuries. After learning these principles, the student designs something completely new. This is Horace's idea of imitation. Learn first, create later. Horace's practical philosophy. Look at the last statement. It says, creatively adapting the works of Greek masters is the path to excellence. Notice the phrase, creatively adapting. Horace admired Greek literature. He believed Roman poets should study Greek masterpieces. But they should never become mere copyists. Instead, they should adapt those ideas, improve them, and create works suitable for Roman society. This practical approach later influenced Renaissance writers, neoclassical critics, and many modern authors. The evolution of mimesis. Now let us connect all three thinkers. First comes Plato. For Plato, imitation is dangerous because it moves us away from truth. Next comes Aristotle. For Aristotle, imitation is natural because it helps us understand universal human life. Finally comes Horace. For Horace, the question is no longer, should we imitate? Instead, he asks, whom should we imitate? His answer is, the greatest writers. This is why the slide is called The Evolution of Mimesis. The same word remains, but its meaning develops from one thinker to another. Here is an easy way to remember these three critics. Plato says, imitation deceives. Aristotle says, imitation teaches. Horace says, imitation trains. Just remember these three verbs. They summarize the entire evolution of mimesis. In competitive examinations, you may find questions such as, who considered imitation a copy of a copy? The answer is Plato. Who described imitation as a natural instinct to learn? The answer is Aristotle. Who encouraged poets to imitate and creatively adapt the works of great writers? The answer is Horace. Remembering these three key ideas will help you answer many objective questions correctly. Let us quickly summarize this slide. Plato viewed mimesis negatively, believing that art is only a copy of a copy and therefore moves people away from truth. Aristotle transformed the idea by arguing that imitation is a natural human instinct through which literature represents universal truths and helps people learn. Horace gave mimesis a practical direction by encouraging poets to study, imitate, and creatively adapt the works of great masters, making imitation a method of artistic training rather than mere copying. This slide shows that literary criticism evolved from philosophical suspicion to psychological understanding, and finally to practical artistic guidance. Now we come to one of the most important questions for competitive exams. Why is Horace still important after 2000 years? The answer is simple. Horace did not remain only a Roman critic. His ideas crossed centuries and became the foundation of neoclassicism in Europe, especially in England. This slide shows the journey of Horace's influence. It begins in ancient Rome, moves into the Renaissance, and finally reaches the Augustan age of English literature. Let's understand each stage. Ancient Rome, the beginning. Everything starts with Horace's Ars Poetica. Written around 19 BC, it became one of the greatest manuals on literary criticism. Horace taught writers that poetry should not be written carelessly. It should follow reason, discipline, decorum, imitation of great models, and artistic balance. His famous principles include: poetry should teach and delight, Utile Dulce. Writers should respect decorum. Art requires hard work and revision. Great poets imitate earlier masters creatively rather than copying them. These ideas remained preserved throughout the Roman world. But after the fall of Rome, many classical texts were forgotten for centuries. The Renaissance, the rediscovery of Horace. Around the 16th century, Europe experienced the Renaissance. The Renaissance means rebirth. Scholars rediscovered Greek and Roman literature. Among the texts they admired most was Horace's Ars Poetica. Humanists believed classical authors represented artistic perfection. So Horace suddenly became relevant again. His work was translated, studied, and imitated across Europe. Two English writers were especially influenced. Sir Philip Sidney. The first is Sir Philip Sidney. His famous work, An Apology for Poetry, echoes Horace almost everywhere. Sidney argues that poetry should both teach virtue and give pleasure. Does that sound familiar? Yes, that is exactly Horace's principle of teach and delight. Sidney believed poetry is the best educational tool because people learn moral lessons more willingly through beautiful stories than through dry philosophy. This is pure Horatian thinking adapted for Renaissance England. Ben Jonson. The second important figure is Ben Jonson. Jonson admired Horace deeply. He even translated parts of Ars Poetica into English. More importantly, he applied Horace's principles in his own plays and poems. Jonson emphasized disciplined craftsmanship, classical structure, careful revision, decorum, and artistic perfection. Unlike Shakespeare's freer style, Jonson preferred strict classical control. Because of this, critics often call him the most Horatian dramatist in English literature. The Augustan Age. Now we move to the 18th century, often called the Augustan Age. Notice the name. Why Augustan? Because English writers admired the age of Emperor Augustus, when Horace, Virgil, and Ovid flourished. They wanted English literature to become another golden age like ancient Rome. Therefore they consciously followed Horace's critical principles. Among all writers, one stands above everyone else: Alexander Pope. That writer is Alexander Pope. Pope practically became the English Horace. His masterpiece, An Essay on Criticism, is filled with Horatian ideas. Pope repeatedly insists that writers must imitate nature, but through the study of classical masters, observe decorum, avoid extremes, revise carefully, and combine beauty with moral instruction. Even Pope's famous advice, "True wit is nature to advantage dressed," reflects Horace's belief that poetry refines reality through artistic skill. Another famous line, "A little learning is a dangerous thing," also reflects Horace's respect for disciplined education. Because of Pope, Horace's rules became the standard of English literary criticism for nearly 2 centuries. Why Horace became so influential? Now the question is, why did so many generations continue following Horace? Because his criticism is practical. Unlike Plato, who mainly criticizes poetry, or Aristotle, who focuses mostly on tragedy, Horace gives direct advice to poets. He answers practical questions like, how should a poem begin? How should characters behave? How many acts should a play contain? How much revision is necessary? What language should a poet use? In other words, Horace writes like a creative writing teacher rather than a philosopher. That practical nature made his work useful for every generation. Competitive exam points. For examinations, remember these important facts. Horace influenced Renaissance criticism through Sir Philip Sidney. Ben Jonson translated and promoted Ars Poetica. Alexander Pope popularized Horatian criticism in the Augustan Age. The 18th century is called the Augustan Age because writers admired the literary ideals of Augustus Rome. Horace became the intellectual father of neoclassicism. These are frequently asked objective questions. So, this timeline tells a remarkable story. A Roman poet wrote a critical letter over 2,000 years ago. That letter inspired Renaissance humanists. It shaped English neoclassical criticism. It influenced Sidney, Ben Jonson, Alexander Pope, and countless later critics. In short, Horace did not merely write a book on poetry. He created a tradition that guided Western literary criticism for centuries. That is why Ars Poetica remains one of the most influential works in the entire history of literary criticism. Now let us bring together everything we have learned about Horace. Horace was much more than a Roman poet. Through Ars Poetica, he became one of the greatest literary critics in world literature. Unlike Plato, who questioned poetry, and Aristotle, who explained how poetry works, Horace focused on how poetry should be written. His criticism is practical, balanced, and directed toward the working poet. Throughout this lecture, we have seen that Horace builds his theory upon three foundations: the subject, poiesis; the form, poema; and the artist, poeta. A successful poem requires all three working together in harmony. His famous principles continue to guide literary criticism even today. Poetry should combine instruction with delight, Utile Dulce. It should maintain decorum, ensuring that language, character, style, and subject remain appropriate to one another. Writers should begin narratives effectively through in medias res, imitate great models creatively, revise patiently, avoid unnecessary ornamentation, and pursue artistic perfection through discipline rather than inspiration alone. Horace also believed that literature carries a social responsibility. The poet is not merely an entertainer but a moral teacher, a civilizing influence, and a guide to society. At the same time, he recognized that perfection is difficult to achieve, allowing minor faults while insisting on constant revision and self-improvement. Perhaps Horace's greatest achievement lies in his influence. His ideas shaped Renaissance humanists such as Sir Philip Sidney and Ben Jonson, inspired Alexander Pope during the Augustan Age, and became the intellectual foundation of English neoclassicism. Through them, his principles of order, balance, reason, and artistic excellence spread across Europe and continued to shape literary criticism for centuries. If we compare the four great classical critics, we can remember them in a simple sequence. Plato asks whether poetry is morally acceptable. Aristotle explains how poetry functions. Horace teaches how poetry should be written. Longinus explains how poetry achieves sublimity. For competitive examinations, remember Horace in one sentence. Poetry is a disciplined art that must teach and delight through balance, decorum, careful craftsmanship, and creative imitation of the classical masters. Like, share and subscribe for more videos for exam preparation. All the best.